At 6:42 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, my family sent me a single sentence that ended the role I'd played for them my entire life. I read it 3 times before realizing they meant every word. The message was simple, brutal, and delivered with the same casual cruelty they'd perfected over decades. We've decided you're too selfish to be part of this family anymore. I stared at those words until my phone screen went dark, then lit it up again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. 28 years of being their emergency contact, their financial safety net, their emotional punching bag, and this is how it ends? With a group text that felt like a corporate layoff notice? Before I unpack everything that led to this collapse, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's hearing this right now because I have a feeling some of you know exactly what this feels like. Drop your location in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in this. You see, I never applied for the role I played in my family. I didn't wake up one morning and think, you know what sounds fun? Being everyone's backup plan. But somehow, somewhere between being the kid who saved her allowance and the adult with the most stable job, I became the person they called when everything went wrong. And everything always went wrong. I was the reliable one. The one who paid her bills on time, who had an emergency fund, who actually read the fine print before signing things. My parents raised me to be responsible, and I took that lesson so seriously that I became responsible for everyone else too. While my sister Emma was busy turning every minor inconvenience into a full-scale drama production, I was quietly becoming the family's human insurance policy. Emma has this gift for making chaos feel like a celebration. Lost her job? Time for a career transition party that somehow required everyone else to cover her rent. Car broke down? Guess we're having a family fundraiser. She could spin a disaster into a social event faster than you could say GoFundMe. And somehow, every single time, I was the one writing the check that made her chaos disappear. My parents master the art of making financial dependence sound like family loyalty. We're all in this together, my mom would say whenever Dad's latest business venture collapsed. Family helps family. Dad would echo when they needed me to co-sign another loan. They made it sound noble, like I was participating in some beautiful family tradition instead of enabling 2 adults who never learned how to manage money. But there was one person who saw through all of it. My Uncle Grant, my dad's younger brother, who would show up to family gatherings and just observe. He never asked me for anything, never treated me like a walking ATM. Grant would watch the family dynamics unfold with this quiet awareness that made me feel less crazy. He was the one person who seemed to understand that something was deeply wrong with how they treated me. Grant would catch my eye across the dinner table when Dad launched into another story about his brilliant business idea that just needed a small investment to get off the ground. He'd shake his head almost imperceptibly when Mom would casually mention that their mortgage payment was late again. Grant saw it all, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. The slow burn started during what I now call the week everything started feeling wrong. I had finally worked up the courage to set a boundary, just one small boundary. I told my family I couldn't cover Emma's car insurance anymore because I was trying to save for my own place. You would have thought I announced I was joining a cult. But it's only $200 a month, Mom said, like I was being unreasonable. You make good money. As if making good money automatically meant I was obligated to subsidize everyone else's poor decisions. I tried to explain that $200 a month was $2,400 a year, that I had my own financial goals, that I was tired of being treated like a bank. But they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. That's when the first crack appeared. My mom brushed off my boundary like it was a minor inconvenience, something we'd figure out later, as if my feelings about my own money were just a small bump in their financial road. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic that I realized this was how they'd always seen me. Not as a person with my own needs and limitations, but as a resource to be managed. Then came the betrayal at work. During a team meeting, my boss mentioned that my family had been calling the office, asking about my salary and benefits. Apparently, my parents had been telling people I made more money than I actually did, inflating my income to justify why I should be covering more of their expenses. They'd been shopping around information about my personal finances like it was public knowledge, using my success to explain why I was the family's designated problem solver. The humiliation of that moment still burns in my chest. My colleagues looking at me with a mixture of pity and confusion while I tried to explain that no, I hadn't given my family permission to discuss my income with my employer. The realization that they saw my financial stability not as something I'd worked for, but as something they were entitled to share in simply because we were related. But the moment that really broke something inside me happened during a family dinner the next weekend. We were sitting around the table and Emma was telling a story about how she'd maxed out her credit cards again. She was laughing about it, treating financial irresponsibility like a personality quirk. "Good thing I have my responsible sister to bail me out," she said, reaching over to pat my hand like I was a faithful dog. The table erupted in laughter. My parents nodded approvingly. And something inside me shattered, not because of the expectation that I'd pay her bills again, but because of how comfortable they all were with that expectation. How natural it felt to them that my money was their money, that my stability was their safety net, that my boundaries were just suggestions they could ignore when convenient. I looked around that table and saw people who had never once asked if I was struggling, if I had dreams that required money, if I ever wanted to be reckless with my own finances just once. They saw a bank account with legs, and they trained me so well to accept that role that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be a person first. The text message came 3 days later. I was at work, finally starting to feel like maybe I could set more boundaries. Maybe I could start saying no more often. My phone buzzed with a group message to the family chat, and there it was. "We've decided you're too selfish to be part of this family anymore." No explanation, no discussion, just a declaration that my worth as a family member was directly tied to my willingness to hand over my paycheck. The message that followed from Emma was even worse. "Maybe you'll understand what family means when you don't have one anymore." I sat in my car in the office parking lot and felt something I'd never felt before. Not heartbreak exactly, because heartbreak implies you've lost something precious. This was different. This was the sound a door makes when it finally closes on a room you never wanted to be in anyway. But then Grant called. He'd been removed from the family group chat too, apparently for the crime of not participating in their financial abuse. "I've been watching this for years," he told me, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. "I should have said something sooner. What they're doing to you isn't normal. It isn't love." Grant had been keeping track. He'd watched them drain my savings for Dad's failed business ventures. He'd seen them guilt me into covering family vacations I couldn't afford. He'd witnessed years of emotional manipulation disguised as family loyalty, and he'd stayed quiet because he didn't know how to intervene without making things worse for me. "I kept thinking you'd see it eventually," he said. "I kept hoping you'd walk away before they destroyed you completely." That night, I did something I'd never done before. I gathered every record of every payment I'd made on their behalf, not because I wanted the money back, but because I needed to see the scope of what I'd been living through. The number made me physically sick. Over the past 5 years alone, I'd given them more than $80,000. $80,000 of my life, my future, my dreams, handed over without question because they convinced me that love meant financial sacrifice. I spent the weekend crafting my response. Not an emotional outburst, not a desperate plea to be welcomed back into dysfunction, a clean, factual breakdown of every responsibility I'd been covering that they'd now need to handle themselves. Mortgage payments, car insurance, credit card minimums, utility bills, groceries, medical expenses, home repairs, vacation funds, holiday gifts for extended family, school supplies for Emma's kids. The list was 3 pages long. I gave them 30 days notice on everything. Not because I was being generous, but because I wanted them to understand the full scope of what they were losing when they decided I was too selfish to be family. I set up automatic transfers to stop, closed joint accounts, removed myself as an emergency contact from their medical records and insurance policies. Then I turned off my phone and experienced something I hadn't felt in decades: silence. Actual silence, where no one was asking me to fix their problems or fund their poor choices or manage their emotional crises. The silence was so unfamiliar it felt uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Within hours, my phone was exploding with messages I couldn't see because I'd blocked them all. Grant filled me in later on the family's emotional journey through the 5 stages of losing their cash cow. First came outrage. How dare I abandon family when they needed me most? Then denial. Surely I was just having some kind of breakdown and would come to my senses soon. Then bargaining. Maybe they'd been too harsh. Maybe we could work something out. Maybe they hadn't appreciated me enough. But when the bills started coming due and reality set in, panic took over. Emma's car got repossessed. My parents' electricity was shut off. Dad's business loan went into default. The house of cards built on my stability came crashing down exactly as fast as you'd expect. They sent flying monkeys, distant relatives, and family friends who'd been fed some sob story about how I'd abandoned my poor, struggling family in their time of need. These well-meaning people would call to tell me how disappointed they were in my selfishness, how family was supposed to come first, how I'd changed into someone cold and heartless. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't changed. I'd just stopped hiding. The person who could walk away from financial abuse had always been there, buried under years of conditioning that taught me my value was measured in dollars transferred and bills paid. They were meeting the real me for the first time, the person who understood that love without respect isn't love at all. I responded to their panic with the same energy they'd given my boundaries over the years, polite indifference. When they called Grant begging him to talk sense into me, he delivered a message that still makes me smile. She's not the one who needs to learn sense. You had a daughter who would have done anything for you, and you turned her into a bank. This is what happens when banks close. My therapist helped me understand what I'd been living through. Financial abuse is insidious because it disguises itself as family obligation. It's not as obvious as other forms of abuse because society tells us that helping family is noble, that blood is thicker than water, that good people sacrifice for the ones they love. What society doesn't tell you is that sacrifice should be voluntary, temporary, and reciprocal. What my family had done was train me from childhood to believe that my worth was tied to my utility. They'd raised me to be responsible so they could be irresponsible with consequences. They'd created a family structure where one person's financial stability was everyone else's safety net, and they'd made me believe that was normal. The hardest part of healing wasn't missing them. It was learning to live with the unfamiliar feeling of keeping my own money. For months, every time I looked at my bank account, I felt guilty. I'd been conditioned to see savings as selfish, to view financial stability as something I owed to others rather than something I'd earned for myself. I had to learn how to spend money on things I wanted instead of things other people needed. I had to practice saying, I can't afford that even when I could. Because for the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own financial goals over someone else's crisis. I had to teach myself that having boundaries around money didn't make me cold or selfish. It made me healthy. The silence that had felt uncomfortable at first became my sanctuary. No more 3 a.m. calls about emergencies that required immediate cash transfers. No more family gatherings where the conversation inevitably turned to who needed what and when I could provide it. No more holidays spent calculating how much everyone else's happiness was going to cost me. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what it felt like to be loved for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Friends who had watched my family dynamics from the outside told me they'd been waiting years for me to see what they'd always seen. Partners who had watched me drain my bank accounts for people who never once asked about my own dreams finally felt safe to talk about our future together. Grant became my anchor during the hardest months. He'd drive by my parents' house sometimes and report back not out of cruelty, but so I could see the natural consequences of their choices playing out. They'd always managed to avoid consequences before because I was there to catch them every time they fell. Without me, they had to learn skills they'd never developed. Budgeting, prioritizing, living within their means. Emma eventually got a job, not a dream job, not a career, just a regular job that paid regular money that covered regular expenses. My parents downsized, sold things they couldn't afford, learned the difference between wants and needs. The family I'd left behind was forced to grow up in ways they never had to when I was subsidizing their dysfunction. I won't lie and tell you it was easy. There were moments when I almost broke. When the guilt was so overwhelming, I nearly called them just to make it stop. Society doesn't prepare you for the reality that sometimes loving people means walking away from them. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. But every time I wavered, I remembered that text message. Too selfish to be part of this family. The family that had decided money was more important than my humanity, that had valued my financial contribution more than my emotional well-being, that had turned love into a transaction where I was always the one paying. I realized that what I'd been mourning wasn't the loss of family, but the loss of the fantasy that they might someday see me as more than a resource to be exploited. I'd been grieving a relationship that had never actually existed, holding onto hope for people who had never really seen me as a person worth protecting. The peace that came with that realization felt strange at first, like wearing new shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. But gradually, it became the most comfortable feeling I'd ever known. No more anxiety every time my phone rang. No more resentment building in my chest while I smiled and handed over another check. No more sleepless nights wondering how I was going to afford both my own life and everyone else's problems. I started dreaming again. Literally dreaming. About travel, about career changes, about taking risks with my money that might pay off or might not. Dreams I'd buried under the weight of other people's expectations had room to breathe again. I remembered what it felt like to look forward to things instead of just dreading the next crisis I'd be expected to solve. If you've ever had to walk away from people you love just to survive, you're not alone. If you've ever been made to feel selfish for having boundaries around your money, your time, your energy, you're not alone. If you've ever realized that the people who claim to love you most are the same people who respect you least, you're not alone. The message that erased my entire family didn't destroy me. It freed me. It freed me from relationships built on obligation rather than affection, from love that came with price tags and conditions, from a version of myself that existed only to serve other people's needs. I'm still learning how to be a person instead of a piggy bank. I'm still practicing the art of putting myself first without feeling guilty about it. But every day gets a little easier, and every day I understand a little more clearly that walking away wasn't giving up on family. It was refusing to give up on myself. Tell me your story. Tell me about the moment you realized that love shouldn't cost you your peace, your stability, or your sense of self. Tell me about the boundaries you've had to set, the relationships you've had to leave, the guilt you've had to push through to save yourself. Because this isn't just my story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been expected to set themselves on fire to keep other people warm.